How many of you have felt so moved about an important issue that you organized a protest or even joined a protest? Protest is often the most visible demonstration of public opinion. In America, we've seen protests over women's suffrage and wars and civil rights and voting and gay rights and nuclear disarmament and school shootings. We've seen marches for science and the environment and for organized labor. Lately, the biggest political protests have been the No Kings protests organized to express discontent with Donald Trump's administration. Hello, I am your host, Marvin King, and on today's episode, I am joined by David Meyer, professor of sociology, political science, and urban planning and policy at the University of California, Irvine. Professor Meyer specializes in social movements, public policy, peace and war, social justice, and social change. He is the author of several books, including The Politics of Protest, that provides a historical examination of the roots of many important protest movements in American political history. Most recently, Professor Meyer is the co-editor, along with Sidney Tarrow, of The Resistance, The Dawn of the Anti-Trump Opposition Movement, published in 2018. His most recent book is How Social Movements Sometimes Matter. David, welcome to the show.
Glad to be with you, Marvin.
Is there a definition of a protest movement? For instance, when does something cross the threshold from discontent and become a protest movement?
There are lots and lots and lots of academic definitions of what a social movement is. And some of them emphasize events, non-conventional political behavior, and some of them emphasize sentiments, a belief in change, and none of them are really satisfying. I think what we want to think about when we think about movements is a continuous to promote some sort of alternative vision of social change that typically includes non-conventional, non-institutional behavior like demonstrations, plus a link to something that is going on inside institutional politics.
So institutional would be like voting,
Lobbying, writing legislation, raising money for candidates, knocking on doors to get people to run for election. So, yeah, and that's an important part of the story that sometimes gets edited out of the narratives we tell about social movements in the past. And people have different standards of applying the label social movements. Sometimes people only want to use it to describe movements that they like. So they say, oh, it's a tough time for movements now because they like movements that might be on the left of the political spectrum. And I would say, well, the anti-abortion movement seems to be doing pretty well right now. I think people deploy different definitions to emphasize the things they like. And if we really want to understand the messy world of politics in the United States, we want to take a broad and inclusive vision that includes all kinds of social activism that spills over from institutional politics.
In your book, The Politics of Protest, you focus on the American context, and you've mentioned a lot there that speaks to how protests could be different in a place like the United States versus in other countries where the institutional way that people can participate in politics may not be there to begin with.
It's it could be much harder to organize. So, for example, in Iran today, the internet is shut down for most people. That makes organizing tougher. There has been tremendous state violence against protesters, whereas in the United States, you can pretty reliably make dinner plans after going to a demonstration. Say, I'm going to meet up with my friend at the demonstration for whatever, and then we're going to go grab burgers. And you could pretty much do that and know you can get home. That's not the case in Iran today. And that affects the nature of institutional politics, and it absolutely affects what sort of protests you see.
My guess is there were a lot of burgers sold in some of the cities that had the big No Kings protests. It seemed they drew impressively large crowds, but relative to our population, how have these protests compared to past protests? And then we'll talk about what they wanted and what their goals were. Just give us a sense of, in a comparative perspective, how do the No Kings protests compare to some of the other big ones we've seen in the past?
Okay, these days, the No Kings protests spread across the United States in thousands of sites, mobilize more people than any other one-day demonstration in American history. Before that, You don't have to go back very far to see the Women's March, which was also the biggest ever, spread across lots and lots of cities. The actual number who turn out, however, although that's something we like to focus on because it seems like it gives us vantage points of comparison, tells us much less about what kind of influence it's going to have. So these days, it is easier to generate a turnout for a cause, to get people to turn out, than it has ever been in the past. So that lowers the bar for new activists. During the Black Lives Matter protests of 2020, some people who had never done politics before would post a time and a place, and people would show up ready to demonstrate because there was a lot of attention to police violence, and it didn't take a lot of organizing skill to get people to turn out. That was not always the case. So you have to sort of adjust the numbers and thinking about what the demonstrations mean. If I go to a protest in Santa Ana, which is a town near where I live that often has protests, it takes me about 15 minutes to get there and then maybe another 10 minutes to park a car. And then I'm home. It's not like a massive commitment. Whereas if you look at the historic demonstrations of the past that, animate our imagination, going to Washington, D.C. for a day and a half takes a tremendous amount of organizing skill and a serious expenditure of time and money. Organizing the event used to be much harder. But there's another side to this. If you spend 7 or 8 months organizing an event, getting people to show up, doing public education to raise money for the infrastructure you need, getting a sound system together and talking to local contractors about making this happen. There's a lot of political education that goes on before the event actually takes place. Nowadays, that political education has to take place after the fact. So that's one important difference. Another thing that we want to talk about, No Kings, is American people have a lot of grievances with the Trump administration. There are people who certainly like him, but maybe oppose a war in Iran. And then people who don't like him for all kinds of different reasons. They may not like him because he's cut funding for science in the United States. They may not like him because he is cutting spending on social welfare programs. They may not like him because they support free markets and don't like tariffs. All those people share one common purpose, which is we don't like Donald Trump. But after the demonstration takes place, what's the message that comes out of that? The broad diversity of people who are engaged in the campaign is an asset in terms of turning out numbers and getting attention and organizing. But it's also a problem in what do you do about that next? What are the demands that come out of that? And I know you've been thinking about that.
I have, and that leads to my next question. How do we know if a protest movement has been successful? Must it lead to concrete reforms or regime change, or is it sufficient to just get public attention?
I've kind of given up on the success, non-success metric. The first Women's March turned out a record number of people in Washington, D.C. protesting against Donald Trump. And the next day, Trump was president of the United States. Do you call that a failure? Well, they didn't get what lots of people wanted. They certainly raised a bunch of issues and animated subsequent activism throughout 2017. So I'd say there's an outcome. It's hard to call it an out-and-out win. At the same time, to say it's not nothing. Demonstrations, if successful, make demands on policy for sure, but they also do the important work of building social connections among activists, raising issues, doing political education, and all that stuff matters over the long haul. And a lot of times the backstory gets edited out. Now, I'm sure your students know a lot about the March on Washington in 1963, which is iconic because Martin Luther King gives this great speech, I have a dream, that echoes in political rhetoric on the left and the right for the subsequent 50 years. And then the next year, there's the Civil Rights Act and then the Voting Rights Act. Wow. You say, that must have won. That mattered. I was surprised to learn when I started studying it that the March on Washington had first been proposed in 1941. It took 22 years to get that turnout in Washington, D.C., and those 22 years included lots and lots of organizing at the grassroots, lots of litigation in the courts, Brown versus Board of Education, lots of teaching young activists protest songs and building communities. So do you say the March on Washington in 1941, which did not take place, was a failure? Or do you say, well, stuff is complicated? And it's a frustrating thing for us as teachers because stuff is complicated. We have to tell longer stories about social movements is exactly the stereotype of the ancient professor that bores students all the time, right? We'd rather know, did they win or not win? Also, if you go back to that iconic successful demonstration in 1963, they were asking for a guaranteed job program. They didn't get that. They still haven't gotten that. I'd say you have to take a more nuanced, complicated assessment for any kind of protest movement.
I remind my students that it was the March on Washington for jobs and freedom, because the jobs part, to your point, is often overlooked. And same with the story of A. Philip Randolph, who the originator of the idea, as you mentioned, to have a March on Washington. But of course, we're about to get into World War II, and FDR didn't want the distraction, so they did anything possible. And to your point, the backstories are so important to understanding the true depths of what happens in protests.
When I started reading about and learning about the March on Washington in 1963, which I did not attend, being a baby, I didn't know who this like skinny old man in a black suit was and why people were so deferential to him. And I thought, like, why are you sucking up good time with this old man? And I know now that A. Philip Randolph is an organizing hero who had massive impact. And then when you start reading about like what America was like and what sleeping car porters did, there's a lot to learn about our past.
David Meyer is joining us today from UC Irvine, and he's helping provide context to better understand protest movements in general and the No Kings protests in particular, talking about A. Philip Randolph, the master organizer. I think is a great segue into this question. The importance of organization and leadership to a movement, and so can protest movements succeed organically without hierarchical leadership? The reason I ask is that I spent a lot of time on the Occupy Wall Street movement in two of my classes, and the Occupy movement fizzled out after the Zuccotti Park occupation ended. So the critique of that movement was its decentralized leadership led to too much democracy within the movement. No one was empowered to decide anything for the group. So applying that to the No Kings protests, is this movement organized for long-term success?
I think some of the local groups are, and some of the local demonstrations are not. And I think your point about Occupy is extremely well taken. So there's this organizing dilemma all the time. Political science students know about Michel's iron law of oligarchy, which says when you have centralized leadership, the leadership always develop interests that are different from the rank and file, and they'll sell you out. And that's not wrong. But the corrective about a fetish on what's called horizontalism and hyper-democratic institutions that are based on consensus or mass agreement creates campaigns that are dramatic, short-lived, unable to innovate, and unable to make deals. I want to tell you about Occupy Los Angeles. Occupy Los Angeles was massive. Big demonstration, destroyed the lawn in front of City Hall. One environmentalist said that was the greatest accomplishment it had, destroying that lawn. As the demonstration drew on and on and on, the mayor of Los Angeles at the time, Antonio Villaraigosa, wanted to support Occupy and wanted to make some political capital out of serving these people who were pushing for action on political and economic inequality. And so he tried to cut a deal with them. He said, look, when you end the demonstration, I'll give you an office in City Hall, and you can continue doing the work you're doing and generate policies that we can work on. And the organizers take it back to the demonstration in Los Angeles. They say, well, we also have homeless people. We need housing. Ragosa says, okay, I'm going to give you 50 shelter beds too. And they say, but we're also about food and the environment. And Villaraigosa says, great, I've got some farmland that I will let you organize on. But they can't cut a deal. They can't get the population at Occupy to agree on anything except continuing the occupation. And so ultimately, the police come and clear out the occupation, and they get nothing. It's hard to code that as a win. There is this difficult balance to navigate between responding to constituents who are engaged in trying to make the world better and democracy, but also strategic leadership that can make decisions and take action, even if it makes people angry, even if it disappoints some of your organizers. And that's an ongoing problem in American politics with all kinds of social movements. Let's not call it a
What
problem. Let's call it a challenge.
challenge of democracy? Uh, Villaraigosa wasn't really this target of the Occupy Los Angeles movement. With the No Kings protests, we know that Trump is the target. So if we could talk about the Trump administration's response to the protests, we've seen a lot of AI videos. It seems that Trump and his allies belittle the protesters, call them names. Thinking about the targets of protests, whether it was LBJ in Vietnam. What is a common response from the target of protests, and how might that make a difference to the organizers of the protest and their decisions on how to continue the protest?
Trump has been particularly dismissive. The sort of template response is what we might like a George W. Bush or George H.W. Bush response to protest movement is saying, I appreciate living in a democracy where people can express different views, and I'm glad to be there, and that makes part of what makes America great. And I disagree with some of the things that some of the people are talking about. During the Cold War, it was also common to say, well, some of these people are really working for the communists or really dangerous. But a lot of Americans are expressing their views in America. That's what makes America great. That Trump has totally missed that playbook is probably a mistake. And it's a mistake to the extent that historically most politicians want to win support of a majority of Americans. Trump has not really focused on that. He wants to serve a base. To my knowledge, that's pretty distinct and different. It's also true that presidents have met with organizers of demonstrations that they disagreed with and didn't like and given at least symbolic inclusion to them. And that's part of, what do we want to call it, the American ethos at its best, that we talk to people we disagree with, that we have debates. And something to be concerned about is what happens if that starts to erode or if that continues to erode, let's say.
I do cover in a couple of my classes when we do talk about the civil rights protests, how the Southern conservative political elite would label the protesters as outside agitators. They would often throw the communist label at them. So trying to paint the protesters as outsiders who are not a part of the in-group, but are a part of some out-group. I don't know if that's an apt comparison to Trump, but it seems that it's that sort of playbook.
Absolutely. I mean, you're in Mississippi where you actually had outside agitators come into the state and do organizing with people who were from Mississippi, where college students from New York and California and Michigan were organizing in Mississippi. They really were coming from outside, but they weren't alone. They were working with other people. And I think the savvy institutional move is to welcome the discussion, have conversations, and then do what you want to do. And it's astonishing to me that the current president of the United States, first president in my lifetime, maybe ever, who has expressed no interest in reaching out to people who don't already agree with him.
Where I'm sitting, dialogue and conversation is the way to go. As a university professor, you have probably experienced something similar. You've got students from all over the place, variety of backgrounds, and it's our job to be able to guide discussion. So I feel a lot of professors are actually well equipped to kind of guide thoughtful conversations. And it would be nice if our leaders could as well. But so to close out the show, I always ask if you could give our listeners a recommendation on readings, a book, an article that could help them better understand the role of protests in the American political tradition.
Well, Oxford University Press would be mad if I didn't say The Politics of Protest Social Movements in America. But really, my advice is to pick something that you care about and read a history of that. And you will almost always see social protest embedded in that history. So if you care about access to marriage equality, there are good books on that talk about the origins of that movement that go back to the 1950s. If you care about peace activism, there are really good books on anti-nuclear activism that go back to the 1940s. If you care about civil rights activism, oh my gosh.
Mm.
Well, everybody should read the letter from the Birmingham jail because that's kind of like interesting prose and it talks about the Constitution and scripture. It's rhetorically masterful. So take an issue that you care about, read about it, and then use that as your starting point. Start with things that you care about.
That's great advice. I'll throw in one book that I've always been a big fan of, David Halberstam's The Children, speaking about the civil rights movement. And I always found that was a great book, learning about some of these young leaders of the civil rights movement who are often overlooked by history, but really made tremendous contributions to the cause.
One of the things that always interested me about it is the organization of the March on Washington in 1963 included giving people directions about what to pack for lunch, right? Like peanut butter is a good lunch on a hot day, whereas tuna fish salad, probably not. And they were training people to be ongoing activists and ideally stay healthy and avoid food poisoning.
That is some good lessons for life that came out of that. All right. Well, thank you so much for your time. This has been really enjoyable. Hopefully we'll be able to catch up with you again later.
Thank you, Marvin.